every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The wind that whips across Ocean Parkway has no memory. It is a raw, indifferent force, carrying the scent of salt and decay from the Great South Bay, bending the tall reeds that line the narrow strip of sand separating the water from the asphalt. For motorists, it's a scenic drive, a causeway of convenience connecting Jones Beach Island to the greater sprawl of Long Island. It's a ribbon of concrete cutting through a protected, almost prehistoric landscape of salt marsh and tidal estuary. In the summer, it's the road to the beach. In the winter, it's a lonely, windswept corridor, stark and beautiful. But for years, this bleakly beautiful landscape held a terrible secret, its shifting sands and dense thickets serving as an unmarked graveyard. The wind may not remember, but we do. We remember the names, the faces, and the years of silence that followed their disappearances. It began, as these stories often do, with a search for one lost person that uncovered a horror far greater than anyone imagined. On May 1, 2010, a 24-year-old woman named Shanann Gilbert vanished. She had been working as an escort and had taken a client in the secluded gated community of Oak Beach, a place of waterfront homes and perceived safety. But something went terribly wrong that night. At 4:51 a.m., Shanann made a frantic, terrifying 23-minute 911 call. On the recording, she is heard screaming, "They're trying to kill me," yet she also seems disoriented, refusing to give her exact location to the dispatcher, who struggled to understand the unfolding situation. The call was a portrait of pure panic and confusion. Shanann fled the client's house, running into the night, banging on the doors of neighbors, her screams piercing the pre-dawn quiet before she disappeared into the impenetrable marshland that bordered the community. For 7 months, the search for Shanann yielded nothing. Her family pleaded for answers, but the trail went cold almost immediately. Then, in December of that year, a Suffolk County police officer named John Malia was conducting a routine training exercise with his K-9 partner, a German shepherd named Blue. They were walking a stretch of Ocean Parkway, just a few miles from Oak Beach. The dog, trained to detect human remains, suddenly veered off the road and into the dense, thorny bramble. There, hidden from the view of the thousands of cars that passed by every day, were the skeletal remains of a woman, wrapped in weathered, camouflage-patterned burlap. This was not Shanann Gilbert. This was Melissa Barthelemy, a 24-year-old from the Bronx who had been missing for 17 months. The discovery was a beginning, not an end. It was the pulling of a single horrifying thread that would unravel a mystery stretching back more than a decade, revealing a serial killer's private dumping ground. Within days, the search intensified. Police officers, cadets, and canine units fanned out, combing the treacherous terrain along a 4-mile stretch of the parkway. The work was grueling. The thicket was a near impenetrable wall of poison ivy, thorny vines, and tangled reeds. Just 2 days after finding Melissa, they found another body, and then another, and another, all within a 1/4 mile of each other, all on the north side of the road, facing the bay. They were identified as Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, Megan Waterman, 22, and Amber Lynn Costello, 27. Like Melissa, all were petite young women who had worked as online escorts. All had been carefully wrapped in the same coarse burlap. Law enforcement now had a name for their phantom: the Long Island serial killer, or LISK. As the search expanded in the following months, the grim discoveries multiplied. The remains of at least 6 more individuals were unearthed, turning this scenic stretch of coastline into one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. For more than 12 years, the case grew colder with every passing season. The phantom of Ocean Parkway seemed untouchable, a ghost who left bodies but no clues, instilling a quiet terror across Long Island. Families grieved without answers, and investigators hit one end after another. The wind kept its secrets, but ghosts, especially in the 21st century, leave traces. They leave echoes in cell towers, fragments in databases, and whispers in their own DNA. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a resurrection. This is not just the story of the Gilgo Beach murders, but the story of how a seemingly unsolvable case was broken open by a new generation of investigators who refused to let the trail go cold. We will explore how they meticulously stitched together the faintest of digital and genetic threads, a forgotten witness description of a pickup truck, a constellation of burner phone pings, and a single strand of hair, to give a name and a face to a monster who lived a shockingly ordinary life. We will examine the anatomy of a double life and the forensic architecture that ultimately led to the collapse of a killer's carefully constructed world. To truly understand the weight of this case, we must first get to know the women whose lives were stolen. They were not just names on a list or faces on a missing poster. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers. The media often reduced them to their profession, a label that allowed the public to create a dangerous distance. But their stories are far more complex. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, of Norwich, Connecticut, was the first of the Gilgo Four to vanish in July of 2007. A 25-year-old mother of two, she was struggling financially. After being evicted from her apartment, she turned to escort work to try and make ends meet, telling her family she was heading to Manhattan for a few days to earn money. She was a loving mother who called her children every night she was away. One night, the calls simply stopped. Her family reported her missing, but the case quickly went cold. Melissa Barthelemy disappeared 2 years later, in July of 2009. Originally from Buffalo, New York, she was living in the Bronx and working as a hairstylist, but also as an escort. She was a tiny woman, just 4 feet 10 inches tall, known for her vibrant personality. On the night she vanished, she told a friend she was going to see a client in Massapequa, a town on Long Island's South Shore. She was last seen on security camera footage outside her apartment building. After that, she was gone. Her family's frantic calls went straight to voicemail until a week later when the calls began. Not from Melissa, but from a man using her phone. The calls went to her teenage sister, Amanda. Over several weeks, a calm, cruel male voice taunted the girl, claiming Melissa was a whore and admitting he had killed her. It was an act of profound psychological sadism, a killer reveling in the anguish he was causing. Megan Waterman, a 22-year-old mother from Scarborough, Maine, vanished in June of 2010. She was in a difficult situation, struggling with addiction and a controlling boyfriend who was also her pimp. She would travel from Maine to Long Island for several days at a time to work as an escort, staying at a Holiday Inn Express in Hauppauge. She always maintained contact with her family, especially her young daughter Liliana. On June 6th, security cameras captured her leaving the hotel. She was never seen again. Her family knew immediately that something was wrong. They drove to Long Island, plastered missing person posters, and pleaded with police. But again, the trail seemed to vanish into thin air. The last of the Gilgo Four to disappear was Amber Lynn Costello, a 27-year-old from North Babylon, Long Island. She lived just a few miles from where the bodies would eventually be found. Amber also struggled with addiction and worked as an escort to support herself. She was known for being witty and having a sharp tongue. In early September 2010, she received a call from a persistent and difficult client. He offered her a large sum of money, but she was wary of him. He was aggressive and had refused to meet her at her home, insisting she come to him. Against her better judgment, and in need of the money, she agreed to meet him. She left her house that night without her purse, expecting to be back shortly. She never returned. Her roommate, sensing danger, tried to keep the client's number, but the man had been clever, using a series of anonymous, untraceable burner phones. These 4 women, who never knew each other in life, were now bound together in death. Their disappearances spanned 3 years, but their bodies were found within days of each other, dumped in the same desolate stretch of wilderness. The initial investigation was a frantic, high-pressure effort. The forensic challenges were immense. The bodies had been exposed to the elements for periods ranging from a few months to over 3 years. The salty, damp environment of the marsh accelerated decomposition in some ways, while preserving them in others. Their remains were skeletonized, meaning most soft tissue was gone. This eliminated the possibility of finding many traditional forms of evidence, like fingerprints, signs of sexual assault, or even a clear cause of death. Some reports suggested strangulation, but without the soft tissue of the neck, it was impossible to be certain. The killer had chosen his dumping ground well. The acidic soil and exposure made the forensic work a nightmare. As the search widened in the spring of 2011, the horror only deepened. Further east along Ocean Parkway, police found the partial remains of another woman, Jessica Taylor, an escort who had vanished from New York City in 2003. Her torso had been found years earlier, 45 miles away in Manorville. But the discovery of her skull, hands, and a forearm at Gilgo Beach linked her definitively to the same geographic area. Not long after, another set of remains was found in Manorville, and the victim's skull was later located near Gilgo. For years, she was known only as Jane Doe No. 6 until 2020, when advances in DNA technology finally gave her a name. Valerie Mack, a 24-year-old mother from Philadelphia who had been working as an escort and vanished in 2000. The Manorville-Gilgo connection suggested a killer who was familiar with remote, wooded areas across Long Island, using them as a 2-stage disposal site. The discoveries continued. Police found the remains of an unidentified toddler, a young girl estimated to be around 2 years old. DNA testing eventually showed she was the daughter of an unidentified woman whose torso was found in a different location, a woman whose body art led to the nickname Peaches. They also found the remains of an unidentified Asian man, dressed in women's clothing, who had likely died from blunt force trauma. The sheer number and variety of victims created confusion. Was this the work of one killer, or were multiple predators using the same remote highway as a dumping ground? The primary theory focused on a single culprit for the Gilgo 4 due to the specific and consistent signature. Petite female escorts, wrapped in burlap, but the other remains opened up a universe of terrifying possibilities. For a decade, these questions hung in the air unanswered. The investigation, which had started with such intensity, began to lose momentum. Leads dried up, public interest waned, and a cloud of suspicion began to form, not just around the unknown killer, but around the investigation itself. One of the most significant factors that contributed to the case going cold was the turmoil within the Suffolk County Police Department. The department was led by Chief of Police James Burke, a controversial and deeply divisive figure. Burke was known for his abrasive style and for fostering a culture of secrecy. Critically, he had a strong aversion to involving outside agencies, particularly the FBI. Despite the Bureau's vast resources, expertise in serial killer profiling, and advanced forensic capabilities, Burke repeatedly blocked their full involvement in the Gilgo Beach investigation. This decision was, to many observers, and to the victims' families, inexplicable and deeply damaging. Why would a police chief actively refuse help on the most significant murder case in his county's history? The answer would come years later, and it was rooted in corruption. Burke was eventually arrested and convicted on federal charges for assaulting a suspect who had stolen a duffel bag from his police vehicle and then orchestrating a massive cover-up within his department. The duffel bag reportedly contained pornography and sex toys. This revelation led to widespread speculation that Burke's obstruction of the Gilgo case was not just about ego, but about fear. Was he trying to prevent the FBI from uncovering his own crimes? Or, as some darker theories suggested, could he have been connected to the world of sex workers himself and feared what a federal investigation might unearth? While no evidence has ever directly linked Burke to the Gilgo murders, his actions undeniably crippled the investigation in its crucial early years. Preventing a unified and fully resourced effort, he effectively froze the case, and for the families of the victims, it was a profound betrayal. The thaw began in February of 2022. A new Suffolk County Police Commissioner, Rodney Harrison, took office with a public promise to bring a fresh set of eyes to the Gilgo Beach murders. He announced the formation of a new, revitalized Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force, a joint effort combining the expertise of the Suffolk County Police, the New York State Police, the Sheriff's Office, and, crucially, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI was finally in. This wasn't just a public relations move. It was a fundamental strategic shift. The new task force was given a mandate to start from scratch. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every scribbled note from the last decade was to be re-examined through the lens of 21st century technology. The original investigators had done their best with the tools they had, but in the intervening decade, the world of forensic science and data analysis had undergone a revolution. The ghosts of 2010 were about to meet the ghost hunters of 2022. One of the first things the new task force did was to meticulously comb through the original case files. They were looking for details that might have been overlooked or undervalued. They found one buried in the witness statements related to the disappearance of Amber Lynn Costello in September 2010. A witness had reported a crucial detail from the night Amber vanished: a heated confrontation between her and a client over money. The witness described the client as a large, intimidating man, looking like an ogre who was driving a dark, first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck. In 2010, this lead was a needle in a haystack. The description of the driver was vague, and Chevrolet had sold hundreds of thousands of these trucks. It was an impossible investigative thread to pull. But in 2022, investigators had tools their predecessors could only dream of. They could cross-reference vast motor vehicle registration databases with other data points. They ran a comprehensive search for every single Chevrolet Avalanche registered on Long Island and in the surrounding areas around the time of the murders. The list was still enormous, but it was a starting point. They began to filter it, looking for owners who might fit other, more subtle parameters of the case. They cross-referenced the list with individuals who lived in areas of interest or who matched a very loose physical description. It was a painstaking, data-driven process of elimination. And slowly, a name began to surface from the noise: Rex A. Hewerman, a registered architect who owned a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. His home address was in Massapequa Park, a quiet middle-class suburb just across the bay from where the bodies were found. His office was in Midtown Manhattan, near the epicenters of those taunting phone calls made from Melissa Barthelomy's phone. Suddenly, the ogre in the pickup truck was no longer a phantom. He was a person of interest, a 59-year-old married father of two, a man who ran his own architectural consulting firm, a commuter who took the Long Island Railroad into the city every day. On the surface, he was the picture of suburban banality. Born and raised in the same house he now lived in, he was a 1981 graduate of Berner High School in Massapequa, where former classmates remembered him as a quiet, physically imposing but unremarkable student. He founded his architectural firm, R.H. Consultants and Associates, in 1994, specializing in navigating New York City's complex building codes for corporate clients like Target and Nike. He was, by all outward appearances, utterly ordinary. The investigators now had a name, a truck, a home, and an office. But this was all circumstantial. It was a compelling theory, but they needed something concrete to connect Rex Heuermann directly to the victims. They needed to find the ghost in his machine. That ghost resided in the vast, invisible web of cellular data. The new task force undertook what is perhaps the most comprehensive and complex analysis of historical cell phone data in the history of American law enforcement. They went back to the original burner phones used by the killer. In 2010, investigators knew these phones were used to arrange meetings with the victims. They were cheap, prepaid phones, bought with cash and designed to be untraceable. The killer was smart. He would use a phone for a short period, sometimes for a single victim, and then discard it. But he made a critical mistake. He operated under the assumption that if the phone itself was anonymous, his location would be too. The investigators of 2022 had a much deeper understanding of how cellular networks function. Every time a phone is on, it is constantly communicating with nearby cell towers. By analyzing which towers a phone connected to and the strength of those signals, investigators can create a rough map of a device's location over time. The task force pulled the historical cell tower data for every single burner phone connected to the Gilgo 4. They then did the same for Rex Heuermann's personal cell phone and the phones of his family members over the same period. They were looking for a pattern, a shadow, a digital echo. What they found was staggering. They created what they called a digital fence around Heuermann's life. They mapped the cell tower activity around his home in Massapequa Park. They mapped the towers around his office on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. They mapped the towers along his commuting route on the Long Island Railroad. Then, they overlaid the activity of the burner phones. The correlation was undeniable. The burner phones, the anonymous devices used to terrorize and lure women to their deaths, were consistently activating and connecting to the very same cell towers as Rex Heuermann's personal phone. When a burner phone was used to contact Megan Waterman, it pinged off towers near Heuermann's Manhattan office. When another was used to check the voicemail of Melissa Barthelemy after her murder, it pinged off a tower near his home in Massapequa Park. The data showed that Heuermann and the killer were, digitally speaking, the same person, moving in perfect, chilling synchronicity. This digital cartography painted a portrait of the killer's methods. Heuermann allegedly used the burner phones primarily when he was away from home, in the relative anonymity of the city, or during his commute. He was compartmentalizing his dark pursuits from his family life. Investigators also correlated this data with another crucial dataset: the travel records of Heuermann's wife and children. They discovered a clear and damning pattern. The disappearances of Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber all coincided with periods when his family was out of state or otherwise away. The quiet house in Massapequa Park, emptied of his wife and kids, allegedly became his operational base. He had the time, the privacy, and the opportunity to act. The phantom of Ocean Parkway was no longer a ghost. He was a commuter, a family man who allegedly leveraged the mundane routines of his life to create windows of opportunity for unimaginable violence. The digital evidence was overwhelming, but the task force still needed something more. They needed his biological signature. For over a decade, a single piece of physical evidence held the potential to unlock the entire case. It was found on the burlap that had been used to wrap the remains of Megan Waterman. Caught in the rough fibers was a single human hair, a male hair. DNA testing at the time confirmed it did not belong to the victim, but with no suspect to compare it to, the hair was just an anonymous genetic marker, filed away in an evidence locker. The new task force saw this hair as their holy grail. If they could match the DNA from that single strand to Rex Heuermann, their digital ghost would become a man of flesh and blood. The challenge was obtaining a sample of Heuermann's DNA without alerting him. This triggered a massive covert surveillance operation. A team of FBI agents and local police began tailing Rex Heuermann. They watched him take the train, walk to his office, and go about his daily life, all while waiting for a single crucial opportunity, for him to discard something that would carry his genetic code. For weeks, they shadowed him. They needed what law enforcement calls an abandoned sample, an item he willingly threw away in public, which they could then legally collect without a warrant. The moment came on January 26, 2023. Surveillance units watched as Heuermann walked down a street in Manhattan and tossed a pizza box containing leftover crusts into a public trash can. As soon as he was out of sight, an undercover agent retrieved the box. It was a seemingly mundane piece of trash, but to the Gilgo task force, it was the potential key to the entire case. The box was rushed to the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. Forensic scientists carefully swabbed the crusts. The sample was analyzed, and they generated a profile of mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. Unlike nuclear DNA, which is unique to an individual, mtDNA is passed down through the maternal line and is shared by all maternal relatives. They compared this mtDNA profile to the one from the mystery hair found on Megan Waterman's burlap wrapping. It was a match. This was a powerful link, establishing that the hair belonged either to Heuermann or one of his close maternal relatives. It tightened the net significantly, but for an ironclad case, they needed his unique nuclear DNA. The surveillance continued. On July 13, 2023, just hours before they would make their move, the task force got the final piece they needed. They collected 11 bottles from a trash can outside Heuermann's home. From these, the lab was able to isolate a sample of his nuclear DNA. They compared this profile to the one from the male hair. The result was unequivocal. The DNA from the hair found on the victim's burial wrappings was a direct one-to-one match to the DNA of Rex Heuermann. The probability of it belonging to anyone else was astronomical. The investigators finally had their man. They had the truck, they had the cell phone data, and now they had the DNA. The invisible threads had been woven into an unbreakable rope. That very evening on July 13th, Rex Heuermann left his architectural firm in Manhattan. As he walked down the bustling city street, a familiar routine at the end of a long workday, he was suddenly surrounded by a team of officers. The architect, the commuter, the quiet family man, was arrested and charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. The Phantom of Ocean Parkway had been caught. The arrest sent shockwaves through Long Island and across the country. For the residents of Massapequa Park, it was a revelation of unimaginable horror. The man in the shabby, overgrown house on their quiet street was now accused of being a monstrous serial killer. His home, which had long been a neighborhood eyesore with its peeling paint and unkempt yard, was now the epicenter of a massive forensic investigation. For 12 days, the street was cordoned off as investigators in hazmat suits systematically dismantled the house in search of evidence, removing truckloads of belongings. What they found inside painted a grim and disturbing picture. In the basement, they discovered a thick metal vault door leading to a small room. More shocking was the arsenal they uncovered. Stored in a large walk-in vault were over 200 firearms. Heuermann was an obsessive collector, a hobby that now seemed sinister. The forensic examination of the house and Heuermann's computers yielded more connections. Investigators found evidence of extensive and disturbing online activity. He had allegedly used the burner phones not just to contact victims, but to conduct thousands of searches for violent, degrading pornography, and, most damningly, to obsessively track the police investigation into the Gilgo Beach killings. He searched for articles about the case, phrases like, "Why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught?" and looked up photos of the victims and their families. He was studying the hunt for himself, a digital predator lurking in the shadows of his own case file. The forensic analysis also unearthed a complicated and troubling new piece of evidence. DNA testing revealed that hairs belonging to his wife had been found on or near the bodies of some victims. The leading theory was one of passive transfer. The hairs could have transferred from Heuermann's own clothes, which had been in contact with his wife and their shared home. This theory was bolstered by the travel records showing she was out of town during each of the murders. She was, in this scenario, another victim, a woman whose life and even her own genetic material were unwittingly entangled in her husband's alleged secret atrocities. She has since filed for divorce, her lawyer stating she was completely blindsided and horrified by the allegations. Following his initial arrest, the net around Rex Heuermann continued to tighten. In January 2024, he was charged with the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. In May, he was charged in the death of Jessica Taylor. And by June, he was charged in the murder of Sandra Costilla, a woman killed in 1993, suggesting his alleged crimes may have begun far earlier than previously thought. The case against him was built like one of his own architectural blueprints, methodical, detailed, and designed to be structurally sound. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges and is awaiting trial, his two lives having finally, violently collapsed into one. The story of the Gilgo Beach killings is a grim reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary of facades. But the story of its resolution is a testament to the relentless evolution of forensic investigation. This case wasn't solved by a deathbed confession or a lucky break. It was solved by patience, by technology, and by the refusal of a new generation of investigators to accept that a case was too cold to be thawed. They succeeded where others had failed because they had new tools, but also a new perspective. They understood that in the modern world, no one is truly a ghost. We all leave a trail. Our lives are tracked by the phones in our pockets, our movements mapped by invisible signals, our identities encoded in every cell of our bodies. The anatomy of this case is, therefore, the anatomy of the modern ghost hunt. It is a forensic blueprint for how to catch a killer who believes he is invisible. The first step was recognizing the value of old information in a new light. The witness description of a Chevrolet Avalanche, a dead end in 2010, became the cornerstone of the investigation in 2022 when paired with powerful database search capabilities. The second was the painstaking work of digital archaeology, sifting through terabytes of historical cell data to find the shadow of a killer's personal phone perfectly mimicking the movements of his burner phones. It was the ability to see two separate digital lives and recognize they were being lived by one person. And finally, it was the power of genetics, the irrefutable truth of a DNA molecule. A single hair, shed perhaps unknowingly by a killer, held the key for 12 years. It was an infinitesimal biological echo, waiting patiently in an evidence bag for science to advance enough to finally hear what it had to say. The Phantom of Ocean Parkway was, in the end, just a man who believed he could build a life of perfect compartments, never realizing that the digital and genetic walls he erected were not for his protection, but were, in fact, the very blueprints of his own cage. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.